Hey Sugar Snaps, welcome to the Textile Indie YouTube channel. If you're new here, welcome in. If you're an old friend, welcome back. Today I'm joined by Sherry, and she has a fun embroidery sampler for us in the Textile Indie motif. So take it away, Mom. I designed a sampler so that you could learn 6 basic embroidery stitches, and once you know these 6 stitches, it will cover about 80% of any embroidery project that you pick up. So the stitches we're going to learn today are the back stitch and the running stitch, French knot, a stem stitch, a cross stitch, and a chain stitch. Here's the pattern that we have. Go across on alternating rows with the basic stitches, fill in with the satin stitch. You've got French knots as your rivets, and then we'll do a cross stitch across here. I think one of the fun things about this pattern, I picked the Textile Indie color palette, but you could do this in a Christmas theme, in an Easter theme. You can make the pattern bigger or smaller on your printer at home, depending on what you want to use it for, and maybe stitch this up to put on a card to give someone as a gift. So it's a really fun and versatile pattern. It comes together quickly, and it's a great way to practice the evenness of your stitches. However, because it's a basket, it's very forgiving because baskets are organic and they're not necessarily perfectly even. So this allows you to do a lot of practice work, and it's still going to come out looking great. We've put together a PDF version of the outline for this design, and you can get that PDF by signing up for our email list using the link in the description below. We will send you the PDF download. You can download that and then change the percentage on your printer when you print it out so you can get different sizes. We have it in a pretty large size, so almost an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper to kind of fill that space if you want to do something large, but if you want to do it a little bit smaller, you could put it down to 50% or less. Now let's dive into the different stitches. So here we have our project in the hoop all ready to go, and I have some floss threaded onto the needle, and it's knotted at the end. This is about 16 or 18 inches long. You will have a tendency to want to thread a longer piece of floss because then you have to thread less. But I've found if you go more than 18 inches, it just ends up knotting on you and you have to start over anyway. So that's a good length to start with. So we're going to start out with the back stitch. The back stitch is one of the most common outline stitches in embroidery. It's a good first one to learn. As a matter of fact, I did embroidery for years, and that was the only stitch I really knew. Speaking of that, I just want to say today that I am no expert. I'm learning along with you. So here we go. So you're going to come up through your pattern on your outline, bring the needle up, make sure you're all the way to the knot. You'll go back about a stitch length, and that's personal preference, how long you want that to be. Pull your floss through, and then you're going to come forward about a stitch length, bring your needle back up through the fabric, and then you'll go back down very close to the hole of the stitch behind you. That's why it's called a back stitch, because we're going to stitch backwards all the way around the outline of this basket handle. So we come up and then we go back. From underneath, we're coming forward, and then we go back. This is a good time to mention that there are 2 techniques that you'll hear referenced when you're watching embroidery videos: the sewing technique and the stab technique. So when we think about the universal symbol for sewing, when people say I'm sewing, they'll make this motion where the needle is going horizontal. That's called the sewing technique, and you'll use that in things like the running stitch where you're kind of going horizontal to the fabric. And then there's the stab technique, which is far more common in embroidery, and that's where you're pointing the needle down perpendicular to your fabric and getting very precise about where you're going to stick the tip of the needle. And that's the stab method, which you're going to use most often. I'm going to finish outlining this basket handle, and then I will be back to show you the satin stitch. Okay, I finished outlining the basket handle, and now we're going to move on to the satin stitch. A satin stitch is often used to fill a space like this, and I will say I think satin stitch and different types of satin stitch are probably one of the embroidery stitches that you spend a lifetime mastering, because it is a little tricky to get to fill carefully without any gaps and to make it super even. So like I mentioned before, this is a very forgiving pattern because it's a basket, so it's meant to look like an organic material. So I'm going to start right here at about the place where my curve starts in my handle,
and come straight up with the stab stitch. Bring the yarn through, the yarn's knotted on the back, and then I'm going to go across to just about the straight spot where that curve meets, and I'm trying to straighten out my line here. Then you'll come up again right next to that one, and also very close to your outline so that you try not to have any white fabric showing through. That's the goal. And then I go back down.
Pause. Okay, can you work that close?
Yep. And you gotta kind of poke around sometimes to find where you're going. Also, I find, see, I have a little gap there. I find if you can pull back your outline stitch a little bit so that you're coming up just underneath of it, that will help to fill in and not leave those little telltale white dots on the edges. Going down. And you will just continue to go around and around until you completely fill in your handle. Now we'll move on to work on the running stitch. So I'm going to adjust my hoop. I took it off. I'm placing it where I want. I think I'll start with this one here. So I want to give myself a little bit of a runway, otherwise it's hard to get the needle at the angle that you want. Stick that on nice and tight. Also, let me mention that if you like these colors and you want to do this pattern, we'll put the numbers to the different DMC floss in the description so that you can pick them up. Okay, the running stitch I think is probably the easiest of all embroidery stitches. If you've ever done any sewing at all, then you know how to do this already. So I'm knotting my thread. This also uses the same dark brown as the outline. And I made dashes. Depending on your pattern, you'll be more accurate or less. But again, this is a forgiving pattern, so I did them just a little bit organically when I traced the pattern. So I'm coming up at the edge of my first dash, and I'm going to come back down at the bottom of the dash. Let me show you a couple of those, and then I'll give you an alternative way to do it. Coming up. I am trying to cover up my lines because I did this with a marker, and so these are not going to wash out. I also don't plan to wash this piece. Okay, so I'm going to come up, I'm going to switch my angle a little bit, and I'm going to shift to the sewing technique. And that's where you're taking your needle down at the end and you're coming back up on that one, down, up. I can usually get about 3 of these before I have to bring it all the way through. Hence, that's why they call it the running stitch, because theoretically you can just run your needle across. If that's not comfortable, you can go back to the stab stitch method. That works just as well. Okay, now we're going to move on to our stem stitch. That's this one here. As you can see, this is looking quite primitive. We'll call that primitive because that's very cool. If I continue to make some of these as gifts, this is a great opportunity to just start evening out my stitches and perfecting them and get better and better at, well, just being even. But in this one, I think this looks quite charming, so I'm perfectly happy with it. For a stem stitch, you're going to cross the stitch. So I'll show this quite a few times. All right, so I'm going to go 1 stitch forward. By the way, these are just dots to keep me in a straight line. They're not evenly spaced and I'm not following them. So I'm going to come almost all the way through, switch my yarn, make sure it's over there. I like to hook my, there we go, hook my thumb through it so it doesn't get all tangled. Then I'm going to bring my needle halfway between that stitch. See, I'm coming up halfway, pull my stitch through. I'm using my thumb to guide that thread so it doesn't knot up, and then I'll pull it tight. And I've created what looks like a stem. So as you can imagine, this is often used when you're doing flowers with stems and leaves. So I'm going 1 stitch forward, over time that starts to feel less awkward, catching that with your thumb. I'm coming up, as you can see, halfway here, and I'm going to pull it through while using my thumb to guide the floss so it doesn't. Now, you see my yarn is coming out halfway between this stitch. So when I go forward 1 stitch, that creates that back stitch effect, we'll say, making it look like a stem and giving it more of a 3D effect. Ah, see what I just did there? So I forgot to bring it halfway up, so I just pulled back and gave myself some slack. Find my halfway point and come back up. Now we're going to attempt the chain stitch, and this is by far the most challenging of the stitches in this sampler, but it's used a lot, so it's well worth getting the hang of. I'll tell you, I was making this and I was listening to a podcast and I had to turn it off when I came to the chain stitch and completely focus. So I just came up through the bottom of the thread. I'm going to pull my thread over to the side and kind of pin it down with my thumb. I'm going to go down very close but not in the same hole and come back out a full stitch length. As you see, the thread is underneath of my needle, and so when I very carefully pull that through, I have my first chain, and that's how you start a chain stitch. So again, I'm going to pull my floss over here to the side and in front of me. I'm now going to come down through this loop and back up like a running stitch, coming forward a new stitch length. With my floss under my needle, as I pull through, it creates a pretty little chain. I've caught my floss with my thumb to the side and in front. I'm going to come down through my last chain, bring my needle forward one running stitch. The needle is on top of my floss as I pull forward, which catches and creates the chain. I'll show you that again. Catch your floss, come down through your loop, forward with your chain stitch. You're coming over the floss and gently pulling to make a chain. This is one where you'll have to be careful with your tension so as not to start buckling the fabric. So you might want to stop every once in a while and just take a look at it. Going down through the loop, up one running stitch. I'm going to make a mistake here on purpose, I think. And this is what happens if you miss it. You end up with this loose loop and it's like, wait, what just happened? So let me see if I can fix this here. So if you get distracted and you don't catch the thread in the right combo, you'll end up with this little floppy loop, and all of a sudden you'll just have a loop that's not attached and go, oh no, what happened? So this is how you fix it. You'll just go back through the loop, and give it a little tug to get the right tension, and then you just pick up where you left off. Catch your thread, come down through the loop. Thread needs to be in front of you. I think what's happening to me here, again, I'm a beginner, so this is a beginner's mind teaching a beginner. As the thread is getting shorter, it's getting harder to keep it out in front of me, and that's when I will tend to make more mistakes on this chain stitch. So I'm going to bring it forward in a running stitch, and see my thread, my floss needs to be under the needle, and that's how it's going to catch and make the following loop. There you go. So I'm going to bring out my floss as much as I can here, catch it out in front of me with my thumb. This is why professional embroidery or serious embroiderers have those stands, those hands-free stands that sit in front of them. Because for stitches like this, you need a third hand. Okay, next up is the cross stitch that you're using on the rim of the basket. This is really simple, and I'm going to show you the easy way to do these. There are two ways, and it depends on how close your crosses are, but this works great. So basically for this one, I just came up right here, and I went down, up, down, up, down, up in a zigzag, and then I came back the other direction to do the cross pieces, and that's a perfectly acceptable way to do a cross stitch, and that's the way we're going to do it today. Another thing about this cross stitch is they're pretty long, so they're a little bit floppy, and I was thinking how cute it would be, especially if you were doing a seasonally based one, to maybe make a little tiny knot to hold these together, or to add a little bead embellishment or button embellishment on these crosses, and you could have a lot of fun with that. So let's just quickly finish up what I have left so I can just give you a demonstration. As I mentioned in the video on tools, I really like the plastic hoops because they have a little ridge that holds things tight. These wooden ones are inexpensive, but they do cause the fabric to shift and move around a little bit. Okay, so let's finish off where I left off on this cross stitch. I am going to do all of the lines that are parallel to each other, so these three, starting right here at the bottom. I'll bring my needle through and then just take it down. I'm going to pop back up over here. I want to stay on my lines because, as I mentioned, these aren't going to wash out. And come back here. And then I'll bring it up in this final line going that direction and down. Now I'm going to come down here, bring the needle up, and go the opposite direction and finish off these two lines in this parallel. There we go. Bring it through, and then I will flip it over and make myself a nice secure knot. Trim it off. There we have the rim of the basket. Now we're going to do the French knot. A lot of embroiderers seem to have a love-hate relationship with French knots, and I will say they are tricky not to get the knot where you don't want it. But I've done this side of the basket already, and as you can see, especially the color contrast or the non-color contrast, it's very subtle, but it's just showing that there's the little rivet in the basket like you would have on a basket handle. So over here, I'm going to show you on the plain white fabric so that you can see it clearly. So let me just set my hoop. With a French knot, you will come through the back of your fabric. I need two of my hands here to do this. And you get a French knot by wrapping your needle. So I'm going to shorten up my tail or my length of my thread here so it doesn't get all tangled. Now, depending on how big you want your French knot, that is how you decide how many times to wrap it. So some tiny French knots, you just wrap it one time around the needle. This is tricky, as I said. For my French knot, I want it to be pretty big because it's supposed to look like a rivet. So we're going to go with 3 loops. So that's 1, 2, 3. So I have it wrapped 3 times around my needle. And then I'm going to take it back down very close to where I came up. I'm going to keep it on the table here until I get myself settled, because this is where it gets interesting. You need to hold some tension on your spare floss as you pull your needle through. Shazam! I got it on the first try. If you don't, you'll just get a big old mess of a bird's nest, and you just have to try to ease it out, or you can cut it off and just start over. So French knots do take a little practice. Don't give up, because once you get them, they're used a lot in embroidery patterns. They're really fun, and they are great for embellishment. This is a good place to mention that I think what will help, and what I should have done, if you take the time after you come through to turn your fabric over and clip this off, you're going to have a better outcome, because the tendency for these little tails to get pulled up through your fabric, it happens a lot, and especially with the French knot. So if you trim those off before you do your looping, you're going to have a better outcome. And there it is, my little French knot. Now I will pull this out, finish my satin stitch, and put it back in so that it looks like this one. I don't want to try to do my satin stitch around my French knot, but this was just so that you could see the contrast against the fabric.